My name is Marcus Chin, and I'm going to tell you about the day my stepbrother Thomas convinced our dying father to change his will, the 5 years I spent homeless while Thomas lived in luxury on money that should have been mine, and the 7 years after that when I systematically dismantled his empire using nothing but the truth, patience, and his own arrogance. This isn't about dramatic family confrontations or violent retribution. It's about legal precision, financial investigation, and watching a fraud unravel under scrutiny he never expected. My father, William Chin, was a real estate developer who built a fortune over 40 years. He wasn't wealthy by billionaire standards, but he owned properties across 3 states worth approximately $30 million. He'd built everything from nothing, immigrated from Taiwan at 25 with $200 and a degree in civil engineering, worked construction jobs while studying English at night, eventually started his own development company. I was his only biological child. My mother died when I was 8, cancer that took her in 6 brutal months. Dad raised me alone for 3 years, then met and married Patricia when I was 11. Patricia brought her son Thomas into our family. Thomas was 13, 2 years older than me, and from day one, he resented me. Not obviously. Not in ways adults could see. But in the small cruelties of adolescence, the whispered insults, the casual sabotage, the way he'd smile when I got in trouble for things he'd done. Patricia never saw it, Dad never saw it, or maybe they did and just hoped we'd grow out of it. We didn't. The resentment calcified into something harder as we got older. Thomas went to expensive private schools on Dad's money while constantly complaining that I got more attention, more love, more respect. He'd tell anyone who'd listen that Dad favored me unfairly, that being the biological son gave me an unfair advantage, that he was the outsider in his own family. None of it was true. Dad treated us equally, split his attention and resources fairly between us. But Thomas needed to believe he was the victim, needed that narrative to justify his growing bitterness. I went to college for business and real estate, planning to join Dad's company eventually. Thomas went to law school, which Dad also paid for, and became an attorney specializing in estate law. At the time, I thought it was ironic that Thomas chose to help people plan inheritances. Looking back, I realized he was preparing. When I was 32, Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was 18 months at most. Dad took the news with characteristic stoicism, started making arrangements, talked about ensuring his affairs were in order. I spent a year and a half helping Dad with his business, learning everything I could about his properties and developments, preparing to take over his company after he was gone. It's what we'd always planned, what I'd spent my entire career preparing for. Thomas visited occasionally, always with Patricia, always staying for short visits before claiming work obligations called him away. At the time, I thought he was just uncomfortable with death, couldn't handle seeing Dad decline. Now I know he was busy with other preparations. 3 weeks before Dad died, when he was heavily medicated and barely lucid, Thomas presented him with a new will. I wasn't there, was back at the office handling a crisis with one of Dad's developments. Just Thomas, Patricia, and Dad in that hospital room. Thomas later claimed Dad had been clear-headed, had made a conscious decision to change his will. But the nurse on duty that day, a woman named Sarah Rodriguez, told me later that Dad had been barely conscious, was on strong pain medication, couldn't hold a pen without shaking. The new will left everything to Patricia, with Thomas named as executor of the estate. Not half to Patricia and half to me, not even a majority to Patricia with some provision for me. Everything. All $30 million in property and assets, placed entirely under Patricia's control, with Thomas managing it all. Dad died 2 weeks after signing that new will. I learned about the change 3 days after the funeral when Thomas, wearing an expensive suit and an expression of fake sympathy, handed me a copy during the reading of the will. "I'm sorry, Marcus," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Dad decided in his final weeks that Mom deserved everything since she'd been his partner for over 20 years. He wanted to make sure she was taken care of. He said you'd understand that you're young and capable of building your own fortune." I read the will in shock. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned with Dad, everything I'd been promised since childhood gone. Transferred to a woman who'd been in Dad's life for 21 years, and her son who'd spent those years resenting me. "This can't be right," I said. "Dad would never do this. We had plans for the company, for the properties. He was training me to take over." "Plans change," Thomas said, "especially at the end of life. Dad had time to reflect on what really mattered, and he decided Mom mattered most. I want to contest this. Dad wasn't in his right mind when he signed this." "You can try," Thomas said, his fake sympathy sliding into something colder. "But I'm an estate attorney, Marcus. I made sure everything was done properly. Dad was evaluated by doctors who confirmed he had testamentary capacity. The will is ironclad. You'll spend whatever money you have left on lawyers and lose anyway." Patricia said nothing during this exchange, just sat there looking uncomfortable but not contradicting Thomas. I realized then that she knew exactly what Thomas had done, had maybe even helped him do it. She'd benefited from Dad's generosity for 21 years, and now she was going to benefit from his death too. I hired a lawyer anyway, used the money from my own savings, borrowed from friends, mortgaged my small condo. I spent 6 months fighting the will, bringing in the nurse, who testified that Dad had been barely conscious, presenting evidence that I'd been training to take over the company, showing that the new will contradicted everything Dad had said for years about his estate plans. Thomas's legal team, paid for with Dad's money, demolished every argument. They had doctors who'd evaluated Dad and declared him competent. They had the properly executed will with Dad's signature. They had testimony from Patricia that Dad had expressed concerns about leaving everything to me, that he'd worried I wasn't ready for the responsibility. The judge ruled the will was valid. Case closed. I lost everything in that legal fight. My savings, my condo, my professional reputation, because Thomas spread rumors that I was a bitter son trying to steal from my widowed stepmother. I lost my job at Dad's company because Thomas, as executor, fired me immediately after taking control. Within a year of Dad's death, I was broke, unemployed, and homeless. I slept in my car for 3 months before losing the car to repossession. I ended up in shelters, on friends' couches, occasionally on the street. I was 33 years old, college educated, with a decade of real estate experience, and I had nothing. Meanwhile, Thomas and Patricia lived in Dad's house, a beautiful property on 2 acres worth $5 million. Thomas drove Dad's cars, managed Dad's company, collected rents from Dad's properties. He posted on social media about his success, his investments, his lifestyle. He never mentioned that it was all built on inheritance, all stolen from his stepbrother, all bought with a dying man's core signature. I spent 2 years in that darkness. 2 years of shelters and soup kitchens, of day labor jobs that paid cash, of trying to rebuild from absolute zero. 2 years of watching from a distance as Thomas and Patricia enjoyed wealth that should have been mine. But I also spent those 2 years thinking, planning, understanding what had happened and what I was going to do about it. You see, Thomas had made several critical mistakes. He was a decent estate attorney, knew enough to forge a technically legal will. But he didn't understand real estate development, didn't understand Dad's business, didn't understand the complex web of properties and partnerships and deals that Dad had built over 40 years. And I did. Because I'd spent a decade learning directly from Dad, understanding every aspect of his empire. I started documenting everything I could remember about Dad's business. The properties he owned, the partnerships he'd formed, the deals he'd made. The questionable decisions he'd occasionally had to make, the gray areas he'd navigated, the times he'd bent rules without quite breaking them. Dad had been a good man, but not a perfect one. Building a real estate empire required compromises, required accepting partners with questionable ethics, required occasionally looking the other way when contractors cut corners. Dad had done what he needed to do to survive in a competitive industry. But all of those compromises, all of those gray areas, all of those questionable partnerships were potential vulnerabilities. And Thomas, who didn't understand the business, wouldn't know where the bodies were buried. I spent 3 months in the public library, using their computers to research every property Dad had owned, every business deal he'd made, every partnership he'd formed. I traced ownership records, building permits, development approvals, corporate structures. And I found problems. Not major crimes, not anything that would have destroyed Dad if it had been investigated, but violations of building codes that hadn't been properly addressed, partnerships with contractors who'd been later investigated for fraud, developments that had been approved through connections rather than purely legitimate processes. None of it was really Dad's fault. These were industry standard issues, the kind of gray area problems that every developer dealt with. But they were all documented in public records, all traceable, all potentially problematic if someone looked closely enough. And Thomas, in his arrogance, hadn't bothered to understand any of it. He'd inherited the empire, but not the knowledge of its vulnerabilities. I also discovered something more significant. Several of Dad's properties were held in partnership structures where Dad owned 60% and other investors owned 40%. The partnership agreements included clauses about what happened if the majority partner died. Thomas, as executor, had assumed full control of Dad's shares in these partnerships without properly reviewing the partnership agreements or consulting with the minority partners. In his rush to consolidate control, he'd violated several partnership provisions that required notification and approval for ownership transfers. Those were legally significant violations. They gave the minority partners grounds to challenge Thomas's control, potentially even to force sale of the properties or dissolution of the partnerships. I reached out to those minority partners. They were mostly other developers Dad had worked with over the years, people who'd known and respected him. I explained what had happened, showed them the partnership agreements, pointed out the violations Thomas had committed. "I don't want to cause problems for your partnerships," I told them. "But Thomas Chen has violated your agreements, and he's managing these properties without proper authority. You have legal grounds to challenge his control." Most of them were sympathetic. They'd known Dad, had known he'd had a biological son, were surprised to learn everything had gone to Patricia and Thomas. Several of them had heard Thomas bragging about his inheritance, had found his arrogance off-putting. "What do you want us to do?" one partner asked. "Demand full accounting of the partnership assets. Require proper notification of ownership transfer. Enforce the partnership agreement provisions that Thomas ignored. Make him prove he has legal right to control your investments." Over the next 6 months, for different partnership groups filed legal challenges to Thomas's control of their properties. He had to hire lawyers, had to provide extensive documentation, had to prove he'd properly inherited and could legitimately manage these partnerships. The legal costs started to add up. More importantly, the scrutiny started to reveal problems. Thomas hadn't been managing the properties well. He'd been collecting rents, but neglecting maintenance, had been making decisions without proper consultation, had been treating partnership assets as his personal property. The minority partners started filing additional complaints. They wanted Thomas removed as managing partner. They wanted independent management companies brought in. They wanted full accounting of all money that had moved through the partnerships since Dad died. Thomas fought it all, spending hundreds of thousands in legal fees. But he was fighting battles he couldn't win because he'd actually violated the partnership agreements, had actually mismanaged the properties, had actually treated other people's investments as his personal assets. While he was tied up in those legal battles, I made my next move. I'd been rebuilding my own life slowly and carefully. I'd gotten a job at a small property management company, started at the bottom, worked my way up by demonstrating I knew real estate better than anyone else there. Within 18 months, I was managing significant properties, had proven myself valuable, was making decent money again. I saved everything I could, lived cheaply, focused entirely on rebuilding capital. After 3 years, I had enough saved to make small investments. I bought distressed properties at auction, properties that needed work but had potential. I fixed them up using skills I'd learned from Dad and knowledge I gained working in property management. I was careful never to cross paths with Thomas professionally, never to bid on properties he was interested in, never to make my presence known in the market. I operated under a corporate name, kept my personal involvement quiet, slowly built a small portfolio. After 5 years of rebuilding, I had a modest real estate business of my own. Not wealthy, not approaching what Dad had built, but stable and growing. I had credibility in the industry again, had proven I could succeed on my own merits. And I had something else. Knowledge of all of Dad's business secrets, and all of Thomas's vulnerabilities. I reached out to Sarah Rodriguez, the nurse who'd testified in my original lawsuit about Dad's condition when he signed the new will. She'd retired since then, was no longer bound by any hospital employment agreements about discretion. "I told the truth in that trial," she said when I met her for coffee. "Your father was barely conscious when your stepbrother brought in that will. He couldn't have understood what he was signing. But the lawyers made it seem like I was lying or mistaken. I believe you. And I want to know everything you remember about that day." Sarah described how Thomas had arrived with the will already prepared, had asked nurses to step out of the room, had spent 30 minutes alone with Dad. When she checked on them, Dad had been distressed, confused, kept saying something about "not right" and Marcus. But Thomas had insisted Dad was fine, just emotional about end-of-life planning. "Did you document this in Dad's medical records?" "I made notes in the nursing log. But I don't know if those notes still exist or if they were included in the medical records provided to the court. Can you help me get complete copies of Dad's medical records from that period? I can tell you how to request them properly. The hospital has to keep complete records for 7 years. If the nursing logs weren't included in what was provided to your lawyer, that's a problem." I filed a comprehensive request for Dad's complete medical records, including all nursing notes, medication logs, and doctor's observations from his final month. It took 3 months and multiple legal demands, but the hospital finally provided everything. The nursing logs told a different story than what had been presented in court. They showed Dad had been confused, heavily medicated, often unresponsive in the days around when he signed the new will. They showed Sarah had documented concerns about his mental state. They showed Dad had said multiple times that he needed to talk to Marcus about his will. None of these nursing notes had been provided during the original trial. Either Thomas's lawyers had suppressed them, or they'd successfully argued they were irrelevant. But they existed, they were part of Dad's official medical record, and they contradicted the narrative of Dad being clear-headed and decisive about changing his will. I took this new evidence to a different lawyer, one specializing in will contests and elder abuse. His name was Robert Kim, and he'd built a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning. "This is good," Robert said after reviewing everything. "But the challenge is that the original will contest was already decided. We'd be trying to overturn a final judgment, which is extremely difficult. What if we can prove fraud? Prove that Thomas deliberately suppressed evidence or coerced Dad when Dad wasn't mentally competent. Then we'd have grounds for a new trial based on fraud upon the court. But we'd need strong evidence of deliberate wrongdoing, not just negligence or aggressive lawyering. Give me 6 months. I'll give you that evidence." I went back to studying Dad's business, but this time I focused on what Thomas had done since taking control. I requested public records for all the properties, traced all the transactions, followed all the money. What I found was stunning. Thomas had been systematically looting Dad's estate. He'd sold properties at below market value to companies he secretly owned. He'd paid himself excessive management fees. He'd diverted rents into personal accounts. He'd used estate assets to fund his personal lifestyle while telling Patricia and the other heirs that the properties weren't generating much profit. Most damningly, he'd sold 3 major properties to a development company for significantly below market value. When I traced the ownership of that development company through layers of shell corporations, I found Thomas's name. He'd essentially sold Dad's properties to himself at a discount, stealing millions of dollars from Patricia and the estate. This wasn't aggressive estate management. This was fraud. Clear, documented, prosecutable fraud. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report: the suppressed medical evidence, the partnership violations, the self-dealing transactions, the systematic looting of the estate. I included financial analysis showing that the estate, which should have been worth $30 million, had been reduced to less than $15 million through Thomas's mismanagement and self-dealing. Robert reviewed the report and smiled. "This is enough. We can file for a new trial based on fraud, elder abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. And we should also report the self-dealing to the State Bar Association, since Thomas is an attorney who's violated ethical obligations." We filed the motion for a new trial in probate court, attaching the comprehensive report as evidence. We also filed a complaint with the State Bar Association documenting Thomas's fraudulent conduct as executor of his stepfather's estate. The legal explosion was immediate and spectacular. The probate judge ordered an emergency hearing. The Bar Association opened an investigation. Patricia, realizing she'd been scammed by her own son, hired her own attorney to protect her interests. Thomas went into damage control mode, hired an expensive legal team, claimed the transactions were all legitimate business decisions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The medical records showed Dad had been incompetent when he signed the new will. The financial records showed Thomas had been stealing from the estate. The partnership violations showed he'd been mismanaging properties he had no right to control. The probate judge ordered a full forensic accounting of the estate and froze all assets pending resolution. Thomas could no longer sell properties, could no longer collect fees, could no longer access estate funds. His cash flow from Dad's estate stopped immediately. The Bar Association investigation moved quickly. They had clear evidence that Thomas had violated attorney ethical rules by defrauding his own stepfather's estate. 6 months after we filed the complaint, the Bar Association suspended Thomas's law license pending full disciplinary proceedings. Without his law license, Thomas couldn't practice law. Without access to estate funds, he couldn't maintain his lifestyle. The house he'd been living in was part of the estate and had to be vacated pending probate resolution. The cars, the bank accounts, the investments, all frozen or seized. Within a year of my filing for a new trial, Thomas went from wealthy estate executor to unemployed attorney facing potential criminal charges. The new trial took 18 months to work through the legal system. The evidence was presented methodically: the suppressed medical records, The coerced signing of the will, the systematic fraud Thomas had committed as executor, the self-dealing transactions, the partnership violations. Patricia testified, breaking down on the stand as she admitted Thomas had pressured her to go along with changing Dad's will, had promised her financial security, had then stolen from her just as he'd stolen from everyone else. "I loved William," she said through tears. "I would never have asked him to disinherit Marcus. That was all Thomas. He convinced me it was what William wanted, that Marcus would be fine, that we deserved the security. I was grieving and scared, and I trusted my son. I shouldn't have." The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating for Thomas. The new will was declared invalid, procured through fraud and undue influence when Dad lacked testamentary capacity. The original will was reinstated, which left half of everything to Patricia and half to me, with provisions for the business to be transferred to me. Thomas was ordered to return all money he'd taken from the estate, all properties he'd sold to himself, all fees he'd collected. The total amount exceeded $4 million. He was also referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution for fraud and elder abuse. The Bar Association completed their investigation and disbarred Thomas permanently. He would never practice law again. I should have felt triumphant. I'd won completely, had proven the fraud, had restored my inheritance, had destroyed Thomas's career and reputation. But mostly I felt exhausted. 7 years had passed since Dad died. 7 years of homelessness, rebuilding, investigation, and legal battles. 7 years where I'd been defined entirely by loss, and the need to restore what was taken. Patricia and I settled the estate quietly. She kept the house and enough assets to live comfortably for the rest of her life. I took control of Dad's company and remaining properties. We divided things fairly, both of us damaged by what Thomas had done, both of us trying to rebuild from the wreckage. "I'm sorry," Patricia told me during the settlement meeting. "I should have seen what Thomas was doing. I should have protected William's wishes. I should have treated you like family instead of letting Thomas turn me against you. You were grieving and scared. Thomas manipulated both of us. That doesn't excuse it. I benefited from his fraud even if I didn't fully understand what he was doing. I helped him steal your inheritance. And you're making it right now. That's what matters." Thomas went to trial on criminal charges 18 months after the probate ruling. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, fraudulent transactions, theft from the estate. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. I attended the sentencing hearing. Thomas, wearing a prison jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits, glared at me from across the courtroom. "You destroyed my life," he said when given a chance to speak. "Everything I built, everything I worked for, gone because you couldn't accept Dad's final wishes." "Dad's final wishes were in his original will," I replied. "The will that left his business to me and split everything fairly with Patricia. You destroyed your own life by committing fraud, by stealing from your own family, by thinking you were smart enough to get away with it." The judge agreed. "Mr. Chun, you violated your duties as an attorney, as an executor, and as a family member. You stole from your stepfather's estate, you defrauded your own mother, and you attempted to permanently disinherit your stepbrother. These crimes warrant substantial punishment." Thomas was led away in handcuffs, and I watched him go without satisfaction or regret. Just acknowledgement that justice, delayed by 7 years, had finally arrived. But something unexpected happened after Thomas went to prison. I started to feel empty. The goal I'd worked toward for 7 years was achieved. Thomas was destroyed, my inheritance was restored, justice was done. But the years of fighting had consumed me, had become my identity, had left me without purpose beyond revenge. I started therapy, trying to process not just Dad's death and Thomas's fraud, but my own response to it. 7 years of my life, from age 33 to 40, spent fighting and rebuilding and destroying. 7 years where I'd had no real relationships, no life beyond the mission, no identity beyond wronged son seeking justice. You won, my therapist Dr. Jennifer Wong said. You restored your inheritance, exposed Thomas's fraud, saw him imprisoned. Why doesn't it feel like victory? Because I lost 7 years. 7 years of homelessness and poverty and single-minded focus on revenge. Thomas stole my inheritance, but I gave away those years chasing justice. He took my money, I gave away my life. Did you have a choice? I don't know. Maybe I could have let it go, could have accepted the loss, and built something new instead of fighting to restore the old. Maybe I could have found peace without justice. Could you really have done that? Could you have watched Thomas live in luxury on stolen inheritance while you had nothing, and just accepted it? No. I would have been consumed by the injustice of it, would have been bitter and angry forever. At least this way I fought back, restored what was mine, ensured Thomas faced consequences. So maybe you didn't give away those years. Maybe you invested them in justice and restoration. The return on investment was your inheritance and Thomas's accountability. That's not nothing. Dr. Wong was right in some ways. The 7 years hadn't been wasted. I'd restored my inheritance, exposed fraud, stopped Thomas from hurting others. But I'd also become someone defined entirely by the fight. Someone who didn't know how to live without a battle to win. Patricia reached out 8 years after Dad's death. She'd been in her own therapy, processing her role in what happened, trying to understand how she'd let Thomas manipulate her. I want to make amends, she said when we met for coffee. Not just the financial settlement we already did, but actually repair our relationship if that's possible. I don't know if it is possible. You were complicit in Thomas stealing my inheritance. I was. I can't change that. But I was also manipulated by my son, deceived about what was happening, used as cover for his fraud. I loved William. I never would have supported cutting you out if I'd understood what Thomas was really doing. You knew Dad, and I had plans for the business. You knew the sudden will change was suspicious. I did. And I chose to believe Thomas's explanations because believing them was easier than facing what he was really doing. That was cowardice on my part. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking for a chance to be honest with each other, to acknowledge what happened, to see if we can build something from the wreckage. We met monthly after that, slowly rebuilding a cautious relationship. Patricia shared memories of Dad, told me things I hadn't known about his life with her, helped me understand parts of his journey I'd missed. She also talked honestly about Thomas, about warning signs she ignored, about her own guilt over what her son had become. I raised him to feel entitled, she admitted during one conversation. I protected him from consequences, made excuses for his behavior, taught him that his comfort mattered more than other people's rights. I created a person who was capable of defrauding his own family. Thomas made his own choices. You're not responsible for his crimes. Not legally responsible, no. But morally. I played a role in shaping someone who could commit those crimes. That's something I have to live with. 9 years after Dad's death, I finally started building a life beyond the fight. I'd restored Dad's company, had grown it carefully and ethically, was successful in my own right now. But success wasn't enough. I needed purpose beyond just making money. I started a scholarship fund for young people from immigrant families pursuing real estate and business, honoring Dad's journey from Taiwan to success. I volunteered with homeless services, using my own experience to understand what people needed, how to help without judgment. I also started mentoring young real estate professionals, teaching them not just about property development, but about ethics, about doing business honestly, about building success that could survive scrutiny. Some of my mates asked about my story, about the gap in my professional history, about why I'd been homeless in my mid-30s. I told them the truth, explained how I'd lost everything, how I'd rebuilt, how I'd fought for justice. "Did the revenge feel good?" one young woman asked. "It felt necessary. But not good. Watching Thomas go to prison didn't heal what he'd done. It just ensured he faced consequences. The healing came from rebuilding my own life, from using what I'd learned to help others, from finding purpose beyond just fighting." 10 years after Dad died, I could finally visit his grave without the anger that had sustained me through years of poverty and fighting. I told him about restoring his company, about honoring his legacy, about ensuring Thomas faced justice for what he'd done. "I hope I made you proud," I said to the headstone. "Not just for fighting back, but for building something ethical, something that honors what you taught me about integrity and hard work." I also told him about Patricia, about the cautious reconciliation we'd built. "She's family, Dad. She made mistakes, but she loved you, and she's trying to make things right. I think he'd want me to forgive her eventually. I'm working on it." Thomas got out of prison after serving 4 years of his 5-year sentence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working retail, living in a small apartment, forbidden from working in law or finance due to his conviction. The man who'd stolen a $30 million inheritance was now making minimum wage and struggling to pay rent. I felt no satisfaction hearing this. Thomas had destroyed himself through his own crimes. I'd simply documented those crimes and ensured he faced consequences. His current situation was the natural result of his choices. He tried to contact me once, sent a letter through Patricia. In it, he admitted what he'd done, acknowledged the fraud, apologized for stealing my inheritance and years of my life. "I was jealous of you from the day my mother married your father," he wrote. "You had his blood, his respect, his plans for the future. I was just the stepson, always on the outside. I convinced myself I deserved the inheritance more than you, that I'd earned it by dealing with being the outsider. I was wrong. I was criminal. I destroyed my own life trying to take yours." I read the letter once and filed it away. I didn't respond. Thomas's understanding of what he'd done didn't change anything, didn't undo the 7 years I'd spent fighting, didn't restore the relationship we might have had if he'd chosen differently. 12 years after Dad's death, I could finally say I'd moved beyond the revenge and into something healthier. I'd restored my inheritance, had grown Dad's company beyond what he'd achieved, had built a life of purpose and meaning. The years of homelessness and fighting hadn't broken me. They'd transformed me, taught me resilience, showed me what mattered and what didn't. I'd learned to survive with nothing, to build from zero, to fight battles that took years to win. Those weren't lessons I'd chosen to learn, but they'd made me someone stronger, someone more empathetic, someone who understood struggle in ways privileged people never would. Thomas had tried to destroy me by stealing my inheritance. Instead, he'd forced me to become someone capable of surviving anything, of building wealth on my own merits, of fighting through years of adversity to achieve justice. In trying to take everything from me, he'd actually given me the tools to take everything from him. The irony wasn't lost on me. 15 years after Dad died, I stood in front of the company headquarters, a building Dad had designed and built himself. I'd restored his company, expanded it, honored his legacy. The business employed over 200 people, developed properties across 5 states, operated with absolute ethical integrity. This was Dad's real legacy, not the money Thomas had stolen, but the values and knowledge he'd passed on. Those couldn't be stolen through forged wills or fraudulent transactions. Those were mine regardless of what Thomas had done. I'd fought for 7 years to restore my inheritance. But the real inheritance, the one that mattered, had never been at risk. Dad had given me his knowledge, his work ethic, his integrity. Those were the assets that had allowed me to rebuild from nothing, to fight successfully, to honor his memory through the life I'd built. Thomas had stolen money and property. But he'd never understood that those were just tools, just resources. The real wealth was in what Dad had taught me, and that was something Thomas could never take and could never understand. 20 years after Dad's death, I could tell the story without bitterness. Thomas had committed fraud, had stolen my inheritance, had forced me into years of poverty and struggle. That was real harm that deserved real consequences. I'd spent 7 years fighting back, documenting fraud, pursuing justice through legal channels, ensuring Thomas faced accountability. That was my choice, my response, my way of honoring Dad and protecting what he'd built. Both things were true. Thomas's crime and my response, his fraud and my justice, his greed and my determination. The story didn't have a simple moral or an easy lesson. It was just what happened when someone stole everything and someone else refused to accept that theft. In the end, I'd won. Restored my inheritance, destroyed Thomas's career, seen him imprisoned. But the victory had cost 7 years of my life, had required becoming someone harder and more calculating than I'd been before. Was it worth it? I honestly still didn't know. The justice was real and necessary. But the cost was also real and permanent. 7 years I could never get back, spent fighting instead of building, surviving instead of thriving. Maybe that was the real truth about revenge. Not that it's wrong or right, but that it's expensive in ways beyond money. That fighting for justice requires sacrifices that change who you are, that winning completely doesn't always feel like victory. I'd made my choices and lived with them. Thomas had made his choices and lived with those consequences. We were both marked by what happened, both shaped by fraud and response and years of legal warfare. And somehow, impossibly, I'd survived it all and built something worth surviving for. That was enough. It had to be enough. And finally, after 20 years, it was.